Whenever numbers like millions, billions, and trillions are discussed, it's often difficult to put the vast difference between them into context. So let's start there. If you, yes you watching, made $1 every second, you'd be a millionaire in 12 days. That's under 2 weeks. But how long would it take to reach $1 billion? 6 months? A year? Well, at a rate of $1 per second, every day, non-stop, you'd need over 31 years. And that's just for 1 billion. As we know, the world's richest have not just 1 billion, but tens, even hundreds of billions. And their wealth just keeps growing. For example, in 2024, their combined wealth skyrocketed from 13 trillion to 15 trillion in just 12 months. And the richest 10 men saw their fortunes grow by an average of 100 million per day. That's more than what entire villages or towns in some parts of the world will earn in a lifetime, every single day. And these guys, the billionaires, have been absolute vacuum cleaners of wealth over the past few decades. The top 1% alone has captured 38% of all new wealth created since 1995. And this is at the same time where the poorest half of the world's population, which is around 3.8 billion people, owns just 2% of global wealth. Think about that for a second. No matter how you look at it, these stats are staggering. The ultra-rich are clearly pulling further ahead, while half the world is effectively locked out of wealth. And it goes further. It's not just numbers on paper. This kind of money can warp economies, influence politics, and shape the world in ways that we can barely comprehend.
You don't see it much on TV. You don't hear it talked about here at all. But the American people do not believe that it is appropriate that 3 people, 1, 2, 3, Mr. Musk, Mr. Bezos, and Mr. Zuckerberg, 3 Americans own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, 170 million people.
And that's not a useless fact either. Massive wealth inequality usually comes before internal conflict, or more accurately, it's a symptom of a deeper problem.
When the government has problems funding itself, when there are bad economic conditions, and living standards for most people are declining, and there are large wealth, values, and political gaps, internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups, greatly increases. This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich.
Ray Dalio, a billionaire investor and economic historian, puts it this way, quote, "I've studied the last 500 years of history and cycles, and these things repeat over and over again. Large wealth gaps with large value gaps at the same time, as there's a lot of debt and there's an economic downturn produces conflict and vulnerability. One of the biggest impacts the rising wealth gap has had is the shrinking middle class. The middle class is one of the hallmarks of a healthy economy, so when they shrink and start to falter, it's a symptom of a wider problem. It's been a slow process, but we all know deep down that something is going wrong." If you think back to the TV shows of the 80s and the 90s, it wasn't uncommon to find characters that lived comfortably on just a single wage. Life was portrayed as financially easy, and that's because relatively, it really was. But then things started to go wrong. When you really think about how the economy has been, since I left high school in the late 2000s, the middle class just couldn't catch a break. In 2008, there was the housing crisis, which turned into an international global financial crisis. Europe got a second wind of that disaster around 2011. In most of the Western world, the average Joe was hit by an economic bomb. Small businesses closed, jobs were lost, and households were struggling. Over the next decade, growth was permanently slower than before because the real economy had died, and I've covered that in detail in a previous video. But other than that, people were still getting by. But then came COVID. The government response shuttered entire economies, leaving everyday people straining themselves just to get by. And there's a famous saying, question, what words do you never want to hear? Answer, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And this joke played out in real time when governments turned on the money printers to counteract their shutdown policies. They thought they were helping, but the result was yet another disaster. Now, today, we're left with rising inflation, stagnant wages, and soaring living costs. And the pressure is only getting worse. The middle 40% of the global population owns just 22% of global wealth. But at the top end of town, it's exactly the opposite. Making money seems easier than ever before. As it turns out, all that government printing helped the stock market, which helped the billionaires. But we'll get to that in a bit. As the saying goes, wealth begets more wealth. So this acceleration will continue. But before we get into the weeds, we need to back up a little bit. How are these guys getting so rich? How does one even become a billionaire? Is it ethical to be a billionaire? Well, that depends on your political leanings, but some individuals do indeed have a rag to riches story, but the pleasantries start and end there. A growing number of billionaires tend to come through one of three routes: monopolies, inheritance, and corruption. According to Forbes, the most common way to become a billionaire is through finance. In fact, nearly 1 in 6 billionaires, or just over 15%, made their money in finance and investments. The second most common way is technology at 12%, and the third, manufacturing, also at 12%. But it's not just by hard work and innovation. Billionaires don't play by the same rules as the rest of us. And in this section, we'll cover the 3 ways that this is the case. Number 1, inheritance. In 2023, more new billionaires inherited their wealth than built it. Every single billionaire under 30 was born rich. The problem is, in a lot of cases, depending on where you are, there's no tax on this kind of wealth transfer. While the average person works decades to build financial security, billionaire families pass down fortunes tax-free, and they keep their wealth locked up in an exclusive family club. Number 2, corruption and loopholes. Many argue that the financial system is designed to protect the wealthy. Just look at the 2008 financial crisis. Banks made reckless bets, crashed the economy, and then got bailed out with billions in taxpayer dollars. It's capitalized the profits and socialized the losses. Meanwhile, millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and savings. And it's not just banks. The very top % of earners avoid taxes like a plague. They stash money in offshore accounts or borrow against their assets instead of selling them. And this means that they don't have taxable income. If I told you that in the US, for example, the richest 25 people in the country paid an effective tax rate of 3.4%, you'd cry foul. Why should the average person be taxed at 6 times more when they earn a tiny, infinitesimal fraction of what the billionaires earn? Well, although unfair, it's perfectly legal, and it's a bit of a rabbit hole. But hear me out. This is called the buy, borrow, die technique. Edward McCaffrey, the scholar who coined the term buy, borrow, die, says that this technique is being abused so much that it, quote, has basically killed the entire concept of an income tax for the wealthiest individuals, end quote. But he goes on to add that it's, quote, the most important tax avoidance strategy today, end quote. So here's how it goes. Instead of working a 9-to-5 wage and then getting taxed like a pleb, the best way to earn wealth is through accumulating appreciating paper assets like stocks. The wealth isn't taxed until these stocks are sold. Yes, a tariff surprise or another stock market shock may make the wealthy sweat a little bit, but overall, in the big picture, over the past few decades, you'd be doing well. And the next step, borrow. Since there are no taxes for loans, the genius part of this is that the wealthy simply just borrow against their existing assets to buy more things. Take Larry Ellison of Oracle, for example. He built a $270 million yacht, an $80 million mansion, and even bought an island worth $30 million, all from borrowing against $30 billion of Oracle stock as collateral. But I know what you're thinking. You can't just keep doing this. These loans have to be paid off at some time. And when they do, these guys are going to have to sell their assets. Well, that's not exactly true. And this is the third part, die. All these guys have to do is just pay off the interest on the loans until they die. If you're dead, you can't be taxed now, can you? Furthermore, when an individual dies, the value that their assets gained during their lifetime is exempt from tax. Their children can then use these gains to pay off the loans. Technically, there's supposed to be a tax on inheritance, but that's no issue for top tax agents. Trust accounts and other arrangements essentially eliminate any tax that has to be paid. This technique is cunning, smart, and hidden away from the average person. And number 3, monopoly power. Monopolies account for nearly 18% of billionaire wealth. When a single company dominates an industry, it crushes competition, sets prices, and dictates wages. Back in the original Gilded Age of the late 1800s, industrial giants controlled steel, oil, and banking. Today, tech giants control global commerce, information, and infrastructure. Amazon controls over 80% of online purchases in major European markets. Google owns 90% of the search engine market. Meta, formerly Facebook, owns 4 of the top 5 most used social media platforms. It's present in other industries too. In Nigeria, Aliko Dangote has a near monopoly on cement. This gives him massive economic and political power across Africa. Gata Madani's conglomerate, the Adani Group, has faced accusations of crony capitalism and monopolistic behaviour, particularly in sectors like ports and energy. But monopolies aren't just about wealth, they're about control. They can even influence government policies. Even though the United States has checks and balances in place to avoid these exact scenarios, it seems like the loopholes are just as accessible. With all of these factors combined, we're looking at billionaire wealth increasing at an unprecedented rate. It's actually not just increasing, it's accelerating. Last year, Oxfam predicted that we'd see the worst first trillionaire within a decade. Now we're on track to have that in 5 years or sooner. But some people, believe it or not, think that this is actually a good thing. They believe that if there's more billionaires, that means that economies are indeed doing well, and it means that there are opportunities to make massive money. And while it's true that wealthy economies tend to create super rich individuals, if you look at the GDP per capita and compare it to the number of billionaires, there's no real correlation. For example, India, Mexico, and Brazil have far more billionaires than Sweden or Switzerland, despite the fact that these 2 European countries have a higher GDP per capita. So what does that mean? It means that in most countries, a handful of ultra-rich individuals control a massive share of the nation's wealth, while the majority of people struggle to get by. Now we have to talk about the financial situations that have allowed billionaires to grow so rapidly very recently. Pumping more money into an economy doesn't automatically create more wealth for the broader society. Leaving aside the inflation risk, there's something else at play: the Cantillon effect. The term comes from Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist. He noticed that when new money enters an economy, it doesn't spread out evenly through society. Instead, it benefits those who get access to the money first. The wealthy and big corporations have first access to new money. They get it through government contracts, central bank policies, and financial institutions. They then use it to buy stocks, real estate, and businesses before inflation kicks in. But for regular people who get their money later, they see higher prices before their wages or savings have a chance to catch up. Think of it like pouring water from a glass onto the top of a very large sponge. The water soaks the top first, but by the time it reaches the bottom, it's soaked through and there's only just a few drops left. And of course, this leads us back to what we talked about earlier. When governments pumped millions upon millions of dollars through the economy through the mechanism of stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and business relief programs, it put cash into people's pockets, which at first seemed great. But then what happened next? Prices skyrocketed, especially, once again, the prices of assets. Housing and stocks went on an absolute tear, and guess who's most likely to own these assets? The wealthy. They already had their real estate and their stocks, so they were happy to see the values soar. Meanwhile, everyday people saw their buying power shrink due to inflation. Once the stimulus money ran out, people were back to where they started, except now, everything was more expensive. And this is why the rich get richer during times of economic expansion. And it's the same reason why the working class struggles to keep up with rising costs. So it really is more money, more problems. And there's some other side effects when new money enters into an economy. Whenever a country's government pumps in more money, it supercharges the stock market. Well, this is not universal, but it's mostly true in the context of modern capitalist economies. And the claim is backed up by this chart, which is adapted from the financial analyst Lynn Alden's research in her book, Broken Money. It shows the super tight correlation between the S&P 500 and government liquidity injections. In simple words, this chart demonstrates that the more money that the Fed and the US Treasury pump into an economy, the higher the stock prices soar. These are all publicly traded stocks, so it must be good for all investors at least. But the problem lies elsewhere. In 2022, the wealthiest 10% possessed, get this, 93% of all stock market equity. That means that when the government floods the economy with money, it primarily benefits those who already have their wealth invested in assets like stocks. For the ultra-rich, it's all their Christmases at once. Meanwhile, for everyone else, enjoy higher rent and struggling to buy eggs.